Tom, you didn't mention it, but can endowment funds be used to improve the sound in the sanctuary? It was a perfect plug, if not. The point is, if you see something here, that's not working, we're getting to it. And that endowment will help with that. So good news on that. Well, here's a very brief summary of history according to the Bible to explain how we got into the situation that the prophet Ben or the prophet Hosea tells us about today. Tall Saul is the first king of Israel. One day Saul goes out in search of his father's goats, and he comes back as the anointed one. But manic worry and insecurity leads to Saul's downfall as king. He is always looking over his shoulder, wondering who is going to unseat him. He consults with mediums instead of trusting in God. And then a young, ruddy shepherd named David becomes the king. And David amasses great prestige and wealth and glory. But as you know, such adornments carry with them their own problems. David has family problems. And as the crown is passed from David to his son Solomon, the problems only deepen. Solomon manages to maintain a united kingdom, and Solomon amasses more and more and more and more and more wealth, which leads to more and more and more problems. Solomon builds the temple of the Lord, but doing so grinds the faces of the poor into the dirt. And by the time it's time for Solomon to pass the crown on, the kingdom splits into two. There is a northern kingdom called Israel and a southern kingdom called Judah. And the prophet Hosea, whom Ben read from today, lives in the northern kingdom, and things in the northern kingdom are not going well. Or maybe they're going too well. They're going too well because there is exorbitant wealth, and that leads to its own problems. In Hosea chapter 10, Hosea says that, quote, Israel is like a luxuriant vine that yields its fruit, and the more its fruit increased, the more altars it built. But these aren't altars to God. They are altars to Baal. Baal, who is the source of rain, the giver of wealth, the cause of the agricultural bounty that surrounds them. So why would a person waste their time with the God who has appeared to Moses on Sinai, the God who commands us to love him with all our heart and soul and mind, and to love our neighbors as ourselves? Why would someone waste their time with a God like that when you could just follow Baal and get rich doing so? Now, according to the Bible, Israel's unfaithfulness to God and their lust for wealth and power and more and more and more and more, this insatiable acquisitiveness, that's the historical setting of Hosea's preaching. But I had to look all of this up this past week because I studied the book of Hosea as a little boy in Bible school, but this wasn't the detail that stood out to me when I read the book of Hosea as a little boy. The detail that stood out to me, the image that seared itself upon my mind, the detail that whomever selects the text and tells us what to read, what they have left out, is what I could not forget. It is what God says in just the second verse of this book. Right in the opening, God speaks to Hosea, and God says, Hosea, go take for yourself a wife of whoredom and have children of whoredom, for the land commits great whoredom by forsaking the Lord. And so this is what always stuck with me, how Hosea marries a prostitute named Gomer, and how Gomer is unfaithful to Hosea, how she sleeps with other men, his children that are not Hosea's, and how this unfaithfulness is supposed to be illustrative of Israel's unfaithfulness to God. Can't you just hear God's anguish calling Israel on the phone? I have been the Lord your God ever since the land of Egypt. You know no other God except me. But the call goes straight to voicemail because Israel or Gomer are out and about somewhere, Now, this image of unfaithfulness, metaphorically expressed as whoredom, sears itself upon the mind, but it's filled with problems, of course. It's rife with misogyny, thinking of the loose woman. How old and wrong is that? And as I've gotten older, I've come to understand that in relationships, finger pointing and placing blame on one person alone usually misses things. But if God is indeed all-seeing and all-knowing, if God keeps a record of everything, and God has kept a record of every act of infidelity that has ever been committed in the history of the world, my hunch is that men have probably committed more acts of infidelity than women. So a more faithful historical rendering of this text would involve a husband and wife. We'll still call them Hosea and Gomer. Let's say they met in law school. Gomer was a better student than Hosea. She helped him with his studies. And they both got good jobs out of law school, working at different big firms downtown. They were married. And then Gomer got pregnant. And so she stayed at home for her maternity leave. And while she was on her maternity leave, Hosea got a promotion, so they did not lack for money. So Gomer was able to stay at home with the kids as they came. There was one child, and then 2, 3, 4. Every morning, Gomer used to get all fixed up and go downtown. She knew how to put herself together, but these days she just wears sweatpants and cleans dirty floors. And Hosea comes home at night, often after Gomer has put the 4 kids to bed, and she's asleep too. And she hears him stumble through the door, and he lays down next to her, and she can smell bourbon on his breath. She looks at his shirts the next day. There's lipstick on the collar. That happens too. And the Bible is still speaking, so we can imagine this. But all of these examples are so fraught, they're so difficult. Fortunately, it's not the only example of unfaithfulness that the book of Hosea provides us with. Ben read another example just a minute ago. The relationship between a parent and a forgetful child. God says, when Israel was a child, I loved him. It was I who taught them to walk. I took them in my arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of human kindness, with bands of love. I bent down to them and fed them. I was to them like those who lift infants to their cheeks. If you ever encounter someone who takes issue with female imagery for God, you may just direct them to this verse or this picture and ask them who it is, ordinarily, who feeds young children, who lifts them to their cheeks. Our church is growing, and we want to get together, not just in worship, and certainly not just in meetings, but during the month. We want to have parties and spend time together. We want to have more groups. So imagine if at the next small group gathering we had, let's say that December 8th party, which you'll all come to, the meal before the concert, we'll all be seated at round tables in the social hall, and as a conversation starter, each of us will share our own personal memories about what it was like to be a baby. You'll share your memories about what it was like to be held to your mother's warm breast, to have food spooned into your mouth, to have your diaper changed, and then to be swaddled up before a nice afternoon nap. This is what we'll talk about, and our social hall will be packed, and it will be utterly quiet. We'll scratch our heads. No one could possibly remember any of this. Even the people who are closest to it can't remember. So, can you forget something that you've never really comprehended? Or to what extent are you responsible for things that are so much bigger than you? Things for which you have no control. A child is born, And a sociologist from a distance could take a look at that child and, using some crude measurements, figure out with a high degree of certainty what the rest of that child's life will look like. The sociologist would just need to know the zip code and the parents' education level or relationship status or income level. And this would give a sociologist a pretty good predictor of how that life will unfold. And I would imagine that most of us have followed scripts of some predictability. Of course, we're all more complicated than that, but if you scanned out, I would imagine that most of what we've done would fit with what would have been expected of us when we were born. We all breathe certain air. Cultural forces are so great. And the same thing must have been true in the time of Hosea with the people of Israel and that god Baal. Everybody was worshiping Baal. So it's just what you did. It's just what you did. I know that my great-grandparents or grandparents never missed church. My own parents maybe missed church once a year. If I wasn't literally paid to be at church every Sunday, I'd probably miss church a little bit more, a few times a year. And my own kids, they're literally paid to be at church too. So they come every Sunday, but I don't know when they get older. I don't know. If you looked at what the sociologists are saying or compared them to their older cousins, I bet they'll go to church a lot less. These cycles of forgetfulness, they are as old as the Bible, as old as Hosea, as old as the people of Israel. And there might not be much that we can do about it. But the strange thing about Hosea, or an honest rendering of faith, or even an authentic life, is that we are asked to open our eyes, not just to the present, but to what has come before us, to forces that are greater than us, to claims that are made upon us in excess of whatever culture tells us we are. God says, you are not just cultural simulations. You are more than this. I have claimed you over and above your culture. And this claim was upon you when you were a baby. And this claim will commend you to God when you die. You're not your own. You are mine, God says. And of course, we forget this, like we forget so much else, because the dawning of consciousness is simultaneously the illusion of self-mastery. I've made myself who I am. I'm in control, we think, but everything stretches so much further back. So then reading Hosea or listening to God or having an authentic worship experience in a place like this gives us something that we cannot take credit for. It gives us God's unstinting love and loyalty over and above our own forgetfulness. Our own forgetfulness, which is rampant and cannot be preempted. So every Sunday we come to this place to remember things that we can't quite comprehend. We come here to remember that we do not belong to ourselves. We do not belong to a culture. We do not belong to a specific time period. We belong to God. So turn to God, but don't take any credit for turning to God. There's a story in the Gospels. I'm sure you've all heard it before. It's the one where Jesus welcomes the little children. Let the little children come to me, Jesus says, and do not forbid them, for it is to such as these that the kingdom of heaven belongs. And let's imagine that the kids were just 1 or 2 years old. And the disciples were preventing it, not just because the kids were little and messy and needed their diapers changed. The disciples were preventing it because it was pointless. These kids weren't going to remember this. And if their parents even were there, their parents wouldn't have had phones. They wouldn't have been able to record that moment with God. The only way that that moment could have meant something is if once those kids grew up, someone said to them, did you know that when you were little, God held you in his arms? God pressed you to his cheek. God loved you. And those kids all grown up would say, no, I didn't know that. And just like Hosea, we'd have to tell him all about it. Amen.